Okay, so it's my job to introduce the panellists to you, but first of all, I'd love to say what a lovely day it is and acknowledge that we're on dark and young country. I've travelled down from a Awabakal country, and so I'm in Newcastle. My GPS took me to Avoca Beach, so I've done the scenic route, and I'm relieved to be here finally. I've also done many of the beautiful bushwalks around this area, and like the Booty Coast Walk, and really, love this area. So to my right is David Stavanger, and he's a poet, producer, parent, and former psychologist living on Wodi Wodi Dharawal land. And he co-edited the anthology Admissions, Voices Within Mental Health, and we might talk a bit about that later. And he's the author of his own collection, Case Notes, which won the 2021 Victorian Premier's Prize for Poetry. He's got a new collection he'll also talk about today called The Drop-Off. And then to David's right is Maxine Beneba Clarke, and she's an Australian writer of Afro-Caribbean descent. Her work includes fiction, non-fiction, plays and poetry. She's the author of over 14 books for children and adults, notably a short story collection entitled Foreign Soil, and her 2016 memoir, The Hate Race, which has been adapted for a stage production which debuted in February 2024. Her poetry collections, and that's why we're here today, include Carrying the World, How Decent Folk Behave, It's the Sound of the Thing, 100 New Poems for Young People, and the follow-up, Stuff I'm Not Sorry For, 99 More Poems for Young People. Maxine. And again, to Maxine's left is Peter Kirkpatrick. He's published widely in Australian literary studies and cultural history, and is an honorary associate professor in the discipline of English and writing at the University of Sydney. He's the author of 3 poetry collections, the most recent of which is The Hard Word, published by Newcastle publisher Puncher and Watman. And he's also the author of The Wild Reciter, Poetry and Popular Culture in Australia, 1890 to the present. So I might draw on Peter first as the kind of person who's published a book about poetry history in Australia, and ask you your take on the first sentence of our session description, which reads, "Over a century ago, poetry was all the rage."
That might be a publicist's overstatement. This session is called Poetry Now. I somehow feel that I'm a kind of Dickensian ghost of poetry past. Because the book is very largely about how poetry came to be widely recited 100 years ago and into the 20th century, but and the reasons why it no longer is. But 100 years ago, people encountered poetry in entertainment, in vaudeville. People would, there would be actors and performers who would get up, often in a kind of Sprechgesang, is it? It's like a half sung, half spoken narrative in verse. You would also encounter poetry, of course, at school. And at school back then, poetry wasn't taught critically. In other words, you learnt poetry at primary school and in high school, early high school, at least, as a form of, I suppose, cultural literacy. People didn't approach it from a kind of a hermeneutic or an exegetical or a critical perspective. It was there to be enjoyed as part of kind of what you were as an imperial citizen in a colonial context like Australia. And both the recitation of poetry in forms of entertainment, as a form of entertainment, and in education, both have their origins in elocution and the history of elocution, which everybody thinks now is kind of this old-fashioned sort of way of training you how to speak proper. But in fact, it arose in the 18th century as a way of increasing the ability of people, often not from particularly privileged backgrounds, to be able to speak in public and to sort of communicate within the ever-growing public sphere. And elocution encouraged the public reading of fiction, extracts from realised fiction. It also encouraged the reading of poetry. And it's from elocution, I think, where we get the practice of recitation as it evolved in the late 19th century, then fed into by the rise, often very much understated, the massive rise of literacy at the end of the 19th century. At the beginning of the 19th century, most people didn't read. By the end of the 19th century, most people did read. And you learnt that at school because you had to go to school from about 1870 on in one of the Australian colonies. And what you did at school as part of your education was to recite poems. And certainly people of my parents' generation, they grew up and were in the time of the Second World War. I mean, they could still remember poems they learnt at school back in the day. Even I'm quite elderly, at primary school, we were taught, as late as the 1960s, these mossy old colonial poems like The Women of the West by George Essex Evans and Bellbirds by Henry Kendall. Of course, is a local personality here. So poetry is a form, it's an art of everyday life 100 years ago. It dies off with the rise of modernism, which encourages a more critical attitude to the text, and also a more historical attitude to the text, I think. It also, the various forms of popular culture, mass culture that evolve. Film, particularly, although the Victorians also combined words with images with magic lantern slides. Film takes over as a major form of distraction, if you like. There's nothing else to do after dinner. Aunt Dot can get up and recite The Man from Snowy River, or you can go to a film. Radio, too, I think, was the real kicker, because there was an assumption early on that radio would be the ideal medium for poetry. But of course, the kind of poetry that people were used to listening to in the 1910s and the 1920s was very much that elocutionary style of loud pronunciation and boisterous kind of delivery, whereas radio requires a much more intimate voice. And the intimate voice of radio killed, I think, the very public space of poetry there. And I might leave it there for the moment.
That definitely rang true for me. I had my father had this book that was covered in brown paper, and he'd get it out every night and read me bush poems before I went to bed. And all I remember, I don't even know who the author is, "We'll all be ruined," said Hanrahan before the night is out. Might have, been quite prescient, considering climate change and the droughts that we're facing now in rural Australia. Okay, David, the next sentence in the session description says it's surged in popularity again, that it's seeing some kind of renaissance recently. What do you make of that statement? Again, perhaps hyperbolic, but tease out some of the truth in it, perhaps.
A surge in popularity. I feel like that headline comes up about every 5 years, but I feel like the last 5 years there is some resonance to that and relevance to that. I think maybe not in terms of popularity, I don't even know how exactly measure that, but I think in the last 5 years, first of all, during COVID, I think there was a turning to connection online and a sense of wanting to connect in an immediacy became really relevant. And I think one thing about poetry is it's a really distilled form, and we'd seen a lot more pathways for poetry beyond traditional publishing. Like I work for Red Room Poetry as an artistic director, which does a lot of digital publishing, but also Instagram poetry. The Insta-poet, which I always find a really dismissive term, the way we have a caveat to a poet because of the medium they choose to use. But there were some poems that were sort of starting to resonate more broadly in those spaces at a time when people felt really isolated. And people also will be responding to the worlds they were experiencing through poetry in those spaces. So I think that was really a significant thing. I think in the last 5 years also, we've seen the prizes open up in Australia, like the Stella Prize. Poetry was not, you couldn't qualify with a body of work that was poetry. And then once they've opened that up, poetry won 2 years in a row. You can clap that. It'll win more too. Evelyn Aralewin's Drop Bear was the first poetry collection to win the Stella, and has now sold 25,000 copies. We haven't seen that. That's really significant poetry sales. To put it in context, an average collection through sort of mid-tier kind of presses, which are amazing operations, usually run by 1 or 2 people, sell between 500 and 1,000. So we're starting to see some poetry collections actually. Another one's Sarah Holland Batt's The Jaguar, which also won the Stella, reaching broader audiences. And we're also seeing poets programmed outside poetry spaces at writers' festivals. Who knew you could put poets not just on with poets, but on with like playwrights and authors, which broadens the audience, but also we're seeing, and Maxine's one of these for sure, multi-genre writers who are poets, or Omar Sheikh is another one, or Omar Musa who does poetry and theatre. Anyone who's working poetry in these different spaces is broadening out the possibilities in the audiences for poetry hugely. And the other thing is performance poetry in the last 5 years, you know, like it's a pathway where the idea of who gets to write poetry, what kind of poetry people get to listen to, and I think in the last 5 years, contemporary poetry is truly representative of our Australian population, probably as much as any art form. So yeah, and the other piece I'd mention is, with Red Room Poetry, it's the 5th year of like Poetry Month, so this idea of amplifying the art form and broadening ways into it, and participatory levels as well, rather than just this didactic thing, page, stage, digital, online competitions, going to a poetry slam. There's so many ways into the form now.
And the Stella Prize is the prize for women and non-binary authors, so just to put that into context. And finally, Maxine, I'll get you to unpack the final sentence in the session description. You've probably got the hardest one till last. What role does it have in our national consciousness?
Yeah, well, we're still waiting for our poet laureate, our promised poet laureate, aren't we? Look, I think it has an increasing role in our national consciousness. You know, I think if you want to know about a place, you read the poets of that place. And whenever anyone is visiting Australia, that's what I'll say. You know, you have to pick up at least 10 poetry collections by First Nations authors and by other Australian authors. They do a great job of telling you the history of a place, but also giving you the soul of a place. And I think that's what poetry is about. It's about those things that through other mediums might be unsayable. I think from my experience, I generally write poetry for adults, but my last 2 collections have been for young people. Because when I was going into schools with my other work, teachers were saying, what can you give us? Where's the work for young people? There's this big gap between reciting poetry in lower to upper primary school and getting to Sylvia Plath in grade 10. And, you know, where is the work in between that? And so trying to plug that gap has been really, really interesting, and just the hunger for, you know, as David said, you know, poetry collection usually doesn't sell, but the first collection I wrote for kids sold about 8,000 copies. And it's in schools, you know, across Australia, because, you know, you have this idea of adult poetry readers, but they come from children who are encouraged to love poetry all the way through school. I think another interesting experience I've had at the moment, I'm a poet in residence at Melbourne University, and they have me teaching in this course called Narrative Medicine. And this is a course they offer to final year medical students, teaching them poetry, memoir, short fiction, because of this idea that when you strip the humanities from a vocation, you know, we've all, I'm sure, seen doctors that don't listen to you, you know, don't listen to the stories you're telling, can't feed back to you what you're telling them. And this idea is that poetry in particular offers you not just something that you use if you're a reader or if you're a writer or if you're in the arts, but it offers something that you can use in wherever you are in your life. And I feel like developments like that course are kind of this acknowledgement that poetry is not just about what's on the page, it's about the skills you get when you're reading something, analysing something that has been written on the page.
Yeah, definitely. And I definitely think it's fair to say that the bush poetry that I was talking about that defined the national literature for so long, Peter would be better at talking about this, has really shifted sort of, and in a way, what's a good word for it? Poetry seems sometimes to be like the nervous system of that and an early adapter, and it seems to really, to me, pick up and the shifts in kind of broader cultural kind of shifts. Really, it's something I'm quite kind of proud of poetry for, I think. And yeah, of their day. So just so you can now get a sense of the sort of poetry that the panellists have been writing, I might get them to tell us a little bit about their latest book and actually read or recite a poem from it. And let's wend our way back this way. So can we start with you, David?
Yeah, sure. Bush poetry was the hip hop of its day. I'm gonna sit with that one a little while.
I think hip hop was the hip hop of its day. You know?
Yeah. Okay. So my latest collection is called The Drop Off. It's kind of cool to be here, you know, with the ocean, and it's kind of about the sudden trenches we don't talk about, and it's primarily about the ephemeral kind of surreal trench of co-custody and being a parent in a co-custody situation, and that kind of whole dynamic of, you know, for a week or for this period you are officially a parent, then you drop a child off, and then there's that sort of drop off in terms of that child's no longer there, trying to document that over time at a time where I feel like there's not a lot of I suppose poetry from fathers or men around these sort of surreal, difficult, complex dynamics. And if there is, it tends to be kind of bitter and angry and cathartic. And I was like, how do we write into these kind of experiences without approaching it like that? I love poetry that documents things that are sort of difficult to articulate and sort of try to create fragments to try to capture those. So my son had turned 18. I'd been co-custody 15 years. I wrote one fragment for every year. I'd had that co-custody, and then a bunch of other poems around the things I'm seeing impact my son's world, particularly in terms of cost of living, basic human rights, what's going on in Gaza, the environment, and what kind of future then hangs around all this as they enter into adulthood. So that's kind of like the framing of The Drop Off. You know, touches on mental health and a few other strange little things. But also, when I wrote it, I had 5 female poets I knew read it, and I said, if you find one angry, bitter image or line, flag it, because that's not what I think poetry's for. So this piece is called I've Been Thinking About Your Birth Lately. When my son was born, I was going through a major mental health episode, so I have fragmented memories of some of that period. So part of this poem was trying to, how do you reclaim a memory you don't quite have when in that you are the central unreliable narrator of your own experience. I've been thinking about your birth lately, striving to recall details of how this started, the gasp of you under fluorescent light. Dreamt up midwives and revolving shifts, witnessing labour stretch nights thin fray. And the transitions, canned laughter to small talk, the switch between active to tableau of rest, dilation of rooms and contraction of sheets. I can't remember what your face looked like under the medic's watchful eyes, whether you smelt of the hot milk of beginnings. Did I bring a change of shirt for the absence of euphoria, the presence of blood? Possibly a nurse was discussing the weather. Beyond the birthing suite, the sun had surely risen. It's impossible to say if I was in attendance, no drugs in me, anaesthetized in other ways. When you were conceived, I didn't want to live, courting the formation of a darker star. I still study your sonogram daily, this postnatal amnesia a sentence. I have the crown, I crave the crown of fine hair, the physicality of child. To hold a living thing knowing it's as much mine as another's, the warm rubber of umbilical cord, thawed calamari tube cut in two for takeaway. The placenta is the body's only disposable organ, though other vital parts of us are expelled after birth. I think we put yours in the freezer to deter predators and reassure other parents. History likes to record firsts. The first time I held you close, I caught fire. Earth-drawn boy, diving reflex engaged to free fall. Breaching silence, you knew my taste in music. Storage boxes forage for clues, trying to retrieve your arrival, I emerge with connective tissue. In that nursery of strange wet babies, considering flight from eternity's wing, monitoring breath's escape, units of dependency measured in the phrases of a lullaby. Sometimes I read your certificate as an unofficial record of life. I have the DNA, know the formal date, still fret when you're late. It's hard to say what kind of parents we will become. There is no way to inoculate against this future heartbreak.
Thanks, David. And Maxine, I guess, do you want to read from one of your children's
Yeah,
books?
I thought I might read. I've got 2 short poems, and I thought I might read them because they kind of mirror each other. They're kind of opposite poems, even though they're from different collections. So this poem is called The Answers. Sitting outside the principal's office while Mr. Sinclair phones my parents, a knot of shame twists inside my stomach. I wrote the cheat notes, faint as can be, tiny little letters along the curve of my thumb. Dad's gonna spit it, not to mention Mum. I dig my fingernails deeper into my palm. They don't know. None of them knows what it feels like to never, ever have the answers. So this is probably for the opposite kid. It's called So What If. So what if you're a nerd kid and always read the blurb kid? A question must be heard kid. I think it's kind of cool. A reading on the bus kid, a science is a must kid, a try your best or bust kid who's not afraid of school. A smash the spelling test kid, a language is the best kid. What book to borrow next kid? Just keep on being you. A mum what star is that kid, an always read the facts kid, a calculate the stats kid who always seeks the truth. So what if you're a nerd kid? You're going to rock the world kid. Your brilliance will be heard, kid. They're just afraid of you. Because you're in the know, kid. But you are not alone, kid. One day you'll get your go, kid. One day the nerds will rule.
I'm pretty sure they'll have books for sale out the back, and so if you don't want to buy it for the child in you, I'm sure there's some other children in your lives that you can imagine might really enjoy, reading poetry that's really pitched to them. And Peter.
Yes, hello. I'm a fairly nostalgic person, which is maybe why I became an academic. The desire to conserve lost and forgotten elements of early 20th century culture. I never knew my grandparents, so there's an absence there perhaps. I'll just read one poem from the hard word that reflects something of my teaching, actually. I taught a unit at Sydney Uni on Australian Gothic. And Australian Gothic, the genre, if it was subgenre of Gothic more broadly, I think says a lot about the failure of non-Indigenous becoming and belonging in this country. It's a very potent way of rethinking the colonial state, I think. Anyway, this is not a particularly grim poem. It's called Australian Gothic, though. Inside the big pineapple, the first question, why, floats dimly in this pulpy light that strains through every yellow hexagon. So you climb the steel whirl of stairs, a keeper in old sea boots, or else a sacristan, rewinding sandalled footsteps to the tower, to where it reads, "Pineapples make a meal, so why not make a meal of pineapples?" Then onwards, upwards to the rough-ended roof, from where you survey a single-minded country of twee little pineapples all around you, with symbols ripe for the picking, and where, but for the crows who'll tell you to get fucked, it's totally your land of smiley faces. Even its waving undulations grin, and the sly brilliance of this extreme heat is like the sky's own blood running into your body's creeks and rivers. Look up. The sun's one enormous emoji, as happy as any pineapple wearing shades and pointing a cartoon glove at you can be. You'd love to hug it and say, "Hi," but suddenly the landscape starts to fold into a tea towel, flicker and unroll like a spool of film, and the once coloured world burns into white radiance. Now you could be a crewless Captain Kirk, lost and alone in infinite blank space, but for this host of pineapple-shaped aliens waving their predatory tentacles and ordering you to take them to your leader. Except that no one's in control, not you, not anything. And it's a mystery how you got here, what you're supposed to do.
So a question for the audience, does the Central Coast have any big things? Oh wow, that could be a claim to fame. Okay. I think we've got a big mosquito at Hexham and...
Big mosquito. What a choice.
Yeah.
What a choice.
Trying to think, big prawn somewhere coming, like Ballina, yeah, anyway. I think I saw a fragment of one driving home from Lake Munmora yesterday, so you might have a... Okay, there we go. Oh yeah, the dinosaur, of course. Yep.
Is it to scale or is it
Good questions. So we have maybe about 20 minutes for us to discuss and 10 minutes for questions around. And so I thought we'd draw it back to this idea of poetry now. And rather than me just asking questions, we'll have an open discussion. And when I thought about poetry now, I really did think about this idea of expanding into communities that you might not necessarily just think is limited to a literary culture or a kind of, poetry community. It's definitely, there is a poetry community. But I think poetry now, I think we do need to broaden it a bit more to think less so of the public, but more so of the community context that it often kind of, to me, seems to really thrive in. I know, obviously, just off the top of my head, David's talked about editing an anthology admissions on poetry and mental health. So, and then also I know you did Solid Air, which is for the spoken word and performance poetry community that we hear a lot about. Maxine's clearly worked with young people and children. And so, yeah, I was wondering, what do you think about poetry now in the context of it being really vibrant in terms of its engagement with community? Maybe, yeah, Maxine.
Yeah, I mean, I come from a different poetry lineage. I come from a spoken word tradition. My parents grew up in London, but they were born in Jamaica and Guyana. And our family was part of the transatlantic slave trade that was taken from West Africa to the West Indian Islands. So in West Africa, you have griots who are the keepers of community and history, and they told stories through spoken word with drums. So I think, often we think of, in the Western context, poetry as having a bit of an elite history. But for me, I think it's always been tied to that concept of community. And certainly in Jamaica and Guyana, you had an enslaved population who weren't allowed to speak their own African language, who weren't taught traditional English. And so they, that's what reggae came out of, these dub poets who were kind of creating poetry in these Creole languages. So I've actually come, I guess, late to the page. I came to the microphone before I came to the page. And so I think for me, it is partly the opening up of poetry to communities that have always worked that way. There are so many communities, including Indigenous songlines and things like that, where there's this tradition of orally reciting and poetry being something that is shared and passed on, and even in terms of subversion. In Jamaican culture, it's like you're passing stories of how to escape the plantations along. So yeah, I think for me, seeing that arrive in Australia the way that it has, and people like David fostering that idea of poetry belonging to everyone, not just people who've had formal training or who've come to it from a particular background. I think the anthologies that David puts together do a great job of kind of encompassing all those different traditions. And naturally what happens is that the Western tradition starts to absorb those things and shift, I think. because although obviously there's a history of recitation, you know, bush poetry and things like that, it's a different kind of oral poetry.
I'll just jump. Yeah. I mean, when I started out as a poet, two things that happened. I consider myself a lapsed psychologist. I ended up I was working in mental health and drug and alcohol, had a major episode, developed a persona. I started performing and running slams. And when I first encountered Maxine, I was also, I was pretty out there, but I was a performance poet as well. And I found a community where I could a space in the slam community and the spoken word where you could get up in a mic. It was a democratization, the pathway to poetry and what poetry could be about and what was required in order to be a poet in those spaces. And then the way poetry is often held in those smaller slam spaces or the open mic scene in Melbourne. I mean, it has some problematic aspects. All these scenes kind of often do. But at its heart, it's like holding a space where people can express themselves. It's a pretty central principle. And when we look at the world right now, and you look at the state of mainstream media and look at what's happening with Trump in America and the idea of freedom of expression that's happening in literature right now and the rescinding of prizes and look at the t-shirt Keri's got on right now. The idea of a space where you can go and express yourself and that will be held and encouraged, that's a beautiful thing. That's a beautiful community. And the extension of that we're seeing now, like if people say to me, if I was going to do anything, one experience in regards to Australian poetry today, I'd be like, go to Bankstown Poetry Slam. Go to a community which gathers around poetry, Western Sydney voices. Like their slam last year at the town hall, 8,000 people turned up. I mean, that's like, when Ginsberg used to read in London. Like it was an extraordinary energy and you felt like you were part of it. It's an immersive thing. It's an immersive community where you're welcomed. And I think that's a really exciting thing, this idea of gathering around poetry and the idea of who gets to now participate in it and what can be, and responding to the world and hearing reflected back at a time where, what is truth and this idea of post-truth and all this stuff and mainstream media not reporting a lot of things. Poetry is reportage in these spaces too. And I'd extend on that to say the anthology that Keri is referring to, Admissions, that came out of a long-term desire to create a gathering space first of all, as a project called Mad Poetry, which came out of Wollongong, poets with lived experience, including myself, often institutional experience. It came from the Mad Pride movement in the UK. It's about reclaiming institutional language on our own terms. Started as physical workshops. There's now a national online workshop through Mental Health Month in October, which I help facilitate. All the facilitators have had a lived experience. Poets are welcome who identify. There's no need to there's no criteria. And we have people coming online for those workshops who are on wards. They're on acute wards coming in, or people who can't leave their house. That's community. It's scaffolded, it's cared for. The thought about, a community project that comes from community, but values the work out of that. So Admissions documents all of those poems, but also a lot of writers like, Grace Tame, that's what I reckon, public figures that have also had mental health experiences that kind of wanted to write about it. So to me, an anthology like that is also about documenting community as well. Yeah.
Definitely. I know your final chapter in The Wild Reciter touches a little bit on the contemporary performance and slam poetry culture. Is that what you wanted to pick up on or something else?
No, I think I want to pick up on the point that apropos community and performance, what's understated a lot in discussions about poetry is its relationship to song and the relationship with popular song to poetry and the lyrics of popular songs. Because I'm sure most of you people can easily remember any number of lyrics from a particular favourite songwriter, Dylan, whoever. And the problem is there's a kind of proprietary relationship over song and poetry, where musicians will always insist you can't take the words from a song out of the performance. The performance is the text. That you can't, as Yeats said, how can you tell the dancer from the dance? Whereas literary people always want to extract the words and look at them separate from the music. I think there has to be some pathway between those two things, Because another reason for the decline of recitation as a popular art form was the fact that there was a lot more popular music around, with recording and with the gramophone and radio coming into being in the early 20th century.
So what did you think about Bob Dylan winning the
I
Nobel
hate him.
Prize
I
for
can't
Literature?
stand him. But I know there's a lot of people who think he's the greatest thing since sliced bread, and of course he got the Nobel Prize. And that generated a whole lot of interesting arguments about precisely this issue. Is he a poet? Is he a songwriter? And I think we have to start blurring those boundaries between performance and physical text on the page.
Okay, Taylor Swift.
Not my taste. I mean, you know.
We're going to go through pop stars one by one, poet. I often feel this idea to kind of like classify somebody as, you know, this artist is a genre, is driven by the marketing machines and Western marketing machines and publishing culture. Like a lot of writers, artists, their text, their work is happening in all these spaces, and then we get this like term of multidisciplinary, and how do we market that? And it's like, you know, I kind of hope the first poet laureate is a hip hop artist. I think that would blow everyone's mind. I mean, Murdoch Media will lose their shit because it's not a bush poet. But I think this idea of like, you know, you have to be one particular thing. I agree with Peter there. It's like if somebody hears a lyric and it's a poem for them, it's a poem. Once you put something out in the public space, let it be what it is to the people receiving it. I think that's really important. Having other people decide, or marketing, or an academic setting, and in poetry, there's often a lot of fear of like, we've lost the purity. What about the pure idea of poetry? But that's often about a bespoke idea of we don't want to share this. We want to keep it and define it for others, which I'm always pushing back against as a writer, a producer, because I'm more interested in what happens. You know, you can decide what we've just discussed here. That's kind of the key to it for me. Yeah.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of a hip hop artist for poet laureate, but I'm on board. So just what I was saying before about how responsive poetry can be, I feel like the poet laureate, that's kind of their main job, is to have those little feelers and be able to produce a poem, which to me, you know, literary poets might not be so good at.
But I bet it's not going to be a hip hop poet, unfortunately. It'll be a page poet.
I mean, I think there are people who are both. I spent a year writing poetry for a national newspaper, you know, that was published every week on a Saturday, and it's the most mail I've ever got out of anything I've ever written. And I remember I'd been writing profiles for the Saturday paper, and I said, I don't want to do this anymore. This is many years ago. And my editor said, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to write a poem, thinking he would never go for this. But unbeknownst to me, the cartoonist had resigned that morning. So they had an empty postcard-sized spot in the newspaper. And so I wrote 2020, it was the year 2020, one poem a week. And I wrote about, you know, franking credits. I wrote about the Friday Strike for Climate movement. I wrote about everyone traipsing off to vote and getting their democracy sausage. I wrote about clergy abuse in the Catholic Church. And some really like difficult topics. And the letters just flooded in. And some were, you know, from people saying, you know, I am a survivor of clergy abuse, and I never thought I would read something in a newspaper where someone could just say, I believe you and I'm sorry. Because of course you can't do that in a newspaper, you know, in a non-fiction context. And that for me, and until then I hadn't really wrote anthemic work. I'd really written about my own life. So it was this real case of like, what is going on in Australia and what are people thinking about, you know, and sometimes my editor would give me a topic. Yeah, I mean, that was a left-leaning, mostly left-leaning newspaper. I don't write for them anymore, but I think the poet laureate, you know, perhaps it's a poisoned chalice, because I knew I was writing for people who were of the similar sensibility to myself. So I knew I could put my politics in it, and maybe they wouldn't agree 100%, but I wasn't going to be too far off.
Yep, good point. I'd be terrified.
I think it's a really bad idea, frankly.
Okay.
Really bad idea.
The UK seems to enjoy having a poet laureate.
We had the UK Poet Laureate out. So I work for Red Room Poetry, and artistic director there, and produce a Poetry Month, which is every August. Across August, you can engage with poetry. You can engage all year. But we had the UK Poet Laureate Simon Armitage over, and they have 10-year terms, and they're paid with a barrel of port. They go to Spain, I think it is, and get this barrel of port. So it's like a really entrenched kind of tradition. Whereas I've been part of the consults for as have a lot of orgs and poets for the Poet Laureate model, and it's kind of exciting because if you look at the New Zealand Poet Laureate in that model, there's the possibilities of what you could do with a contemporary kind of, but it is going to be interesting. Yeah, it's going to need a lot of scaffolding from the community because you're putting that particular figure at a time when, the Australian is putting out like hit lists of writers that who are writing into spaces they're not comfortable with politically. That laureate is going to need a lot of scaffolding and care from the likes of us, this whole room. I think it's going to be it could be an incredible thing, but it's going to need a lot of care put into it.
Would you do it, David?
Fuck no.
Neither would I.
I don't think having a 52-year-old white guy as a laureate, that's not representative of poetry today. Would you, Maxine? I think you'd be an amazing laureate. Yeah. But on hip hop, I don't know if you know these writers, but Omar Musa, Luca Lesson, Dobby, they all started out in hip hop, still do hip hop. They're all feasible poet laureates. The possibility of having someone that actually connects to younger people and the continuum and possibilities of poetry, it's a real thing. It doesn't have to look like me. No.
But it also sounds to me like, you guys are doing what the Poet Laureate would just be platformed to do, but reaching out to young people in schools and, working with people in, mental health. These are the kinds of expectations, I guess, that would come with a Poet Laureate position now, is to be a poet for the people, I guess.
Just quickly, you make a really good point. There's all this discussion of who the laureate's going to be. I don't think the laureate's that important.
Yeah.
I'm more interested in the model. What's its remit? I've been encouraging Creative Australia, make it an open application. Make people write what they're going to do with this platform, how it's going to intersect with what's already happening, as opposed to discussions of who, there are still people that, going, well, Les Murray's dead, but make him laureate. It's that kind of mentality. Who cares who's the laureate? What's the model? What's it going to do?
Interesting. And how much port? All right. Well, I think we're almost at, 20 past, and we were going to leave 10 minutes for questions. And seeing we've got a rowdy audience, we're open to questions about poetry now, poetry then. And if you're not familiar with the poetry community, don't be afraid to ask a question, as someone who's not as kind of literate in the scene. Is there anyone who'd like to kick off audience Q&A?
Here we go.
I was going to dob you in if you didn't, Chris.
Keri. I think one of the things I've heard said is that in the most difficult times, poetry becomes more looked to and speaks to people more. How come? What does it do that's different in the most difficult times?
I think the poem on my back is a really good example.
I mean, it's often said of the Second World War that they didn't produce as many good poets as the British produced in the First World War, probably as a function of the fact of the decline of poetry as a popular art form, I expect. But I'm not sure that it is. I mean, people, do they? When was the last sort of national crisis where people turned to poetry? Do you know? Can you think of one?
Through COVID, there was a huge
Okay.
reconnecting.
On social media or where?
Yeah, I think.
Okay. Maybe it's a function of the fractured nature of social media, that there's not as once upon a time, I don't know, Siegfried Sassoon would send a poem to the Times and everybody would read it, that there's not that sort of more constrained public sphere. It's a more organic, as it were, public sphere, communal sphere. I don't know.
I was going to mention one clear example for me of that is the Gaza Poetry Society, which you can follow on Instagram. These are poets writing, they're putting them up weekly, poems in real time while there's an active genocide going on. There's a great example of the immediacy and documentation of something. And it's like, every time I read them, it kind of makes every other poem I read irrelevant. To me, it's the most pure poetry you can read right now. And it's hard to read, but it's right there.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, I think it's just to do with emotion. I think, particularly in the Western world, we're so schooled to not show emotion to each other, even to the people we love. And I think poetry offers that vulnerability. I had a parent, there's a poem in one of my collections that's about a divorce, and it's called For Keeps, and it's just about this idea of parents separating and kids kind of not understanding, going to another house, and the kid finally, things finally start to feel normal. And this parent said to me, oh, my daughter loves that poem, and when she's sad, she'll read it and she'll cry, which made me feel terrible. I said, she'd been through a divorce, and she said, no, it's just like, it's a conduit through which she reads it, and she feels like, because it's sad, she's allowed to cry, even though she might be crying about something completely different. And I found that really interesting, this idea that because the language has evoked something, you're given permission to feel,
Thank you. So, more to Maxine, would you like to see a separate children's poet laureate?
Oh, definitely. Let's have a whole team of children's poet laureates.
Poet laureates.
Yeah, poet laureates. That's perfect. Let's write a submission. I think children's poetry. I mean, as I said, I wrote it as a special project. Let's sit down and try and fill this gap. And I just fell in love with writing poetry for kids. And just remembering back to primary school when you used to love reciting poetry and love, there was none of this kind of hesitancy that young teenagers have. So yes, more kids' poetry.
Can I just quickly add to that too? Like at Red Room, we've just got development funding to investigate the possibility of developing a youth poet laureate scheme to go aside, having youth poet laureate in each state aged between like 16 and 25. And we're actually consulting through, Emerging Young Writers Festival, National Young Writers Festival, through schools, what would a youth poet laureate, what does a laureate actually mean in those sort of age groups? So yeah, it's good timing to ask that.
Thank you. My brain's on fire. I'm still trying to formulate the question. I just love all the ideas and thoughts and memories you guys are activating. Maxine, it's everyone's entry into poetry, I imagine, is as a kid, you're making me remember when I was a child and I would write poetry and love it, and thinking of all the ways poetry intersects all the parts of my life and I've forgotten. So thank you, all of you, for that. One of my professions is a celebrant, and I just realised I get paid to say poetry. I'm just like, oh wow. And that made me think. I've got two questions. I'm absolutely fascinated about narrative medicine and poetry and language as medicine, especially because I work in the area of death care and dying and sacred dying. And as professional poets yourself, how do you want people to, continue your poetry? Like I have lots of people who are reading their access into being able to contribute something in a funeral ceremony, for example, is to read a poem and find a poem, and sometimes they're just really recycling the old tropes that are just sort of readily available at first glance on the internet. And I just wondered, what is the way to increase people's access or participation and kind of remembering poetry as a really core expression of everyone's lives?
Thank you. I think Red Room Poetry that David runs is a really great resource. It's an online website, so there's lots of poems there that are free to access, and also you can go down the rabbit hole of, if you like a poet, you can then kind of find their work. And I think a lot of word of mouth. We were talking in the green room and I was saying to David, I taught your poem at the university the other day, and I was talking about how another poet friend of ours, Andy Jackson, his work turned up in my daughter's homework. And we're saying these are the things that we don't, unless we talk to each other like this, we don't know that this work is, so word of mouth, you know, telling people about collections, if you have a book club, reading work and sharing it, yeah.
I was just going to say, I really wanted to be a wedding celebrant because I was like, funeral. But I like the idea of like, you know, because I could sort of like be there as like, you know, like draw on psychology when they first get together. I can form the poem, I can do the ceremony, and when they go through separation counselling, I'm there for it too. And then if one of them dies, I'll write a eulogy. It was like, it just seemed like a really, anyway, here we are.
And I think there is a poet apocryphy, is that the word? How do you say that word? In the UK, where you can be prescribed a poem. Yeah.
I've actually asked one of my couples who are a marriage therapist as well, and I've given them a coaching task to find a poem a day to read to each other to share what they're feeling.
Good idea. I think there was a question over here. Yeah. Two more.
I kind of wanted to ask in regards to like poetry now. I think there's a lot more platform with things like social media for people to be able to like put their poetry out there. And I kind of wanted to ask a bit of a controversial question, which is like, do you think that's given rise to a lot of really bad poetry that's come out and people could just put it out there with no sort of need for it to be published or anything?
My answer would be, there's always been bad poetry.
Yeah. That's a great answer.
There's a chapter in my book, The Wild Reciter, about the poetry of John Laws, whose books would sell 17,000 copies in the 1970s. He was hugely popular. So, yeah, it's there. It's plentiful, you know. It doesn't need to be helped along. It's just in the environment like weeds.
Yeah, I would concur. There's always been bad poetry. I also think we also need to be wary of gatekeepers. You know, I don't publish my poetry in literary journals, and like maybe 20 years ago I had one or two in literary journals. And part of it was because when I started writing, I had very young kids and was a single parent. I didn't have time to be sending stuff off to literary journals. Part of it was because I came from spoken word background. But I think David is the only person in Australia who's anthologised my work because it hasn't been in literary journals, yeah. And so this idea that if it doesn't have that stamp, I mean, maybe it will probably be accepted if I sent it in, but it's just kind of, I just don't do it. And to be honest, I'm a bit lazy, you know. So yeah, that idea that something that hasn't been passed through the gatekeepers isn't good enough, I think we have to be careful of that as well, because as we know, if the gatekeepers don't look like us or have our poetry lineage, the likelihood of us getting through that door is less.
I just wanted to throw one quick comment, like Rupi Kaur. One of the most boring, and I'll always push back if amongst other poets, is they're kind of shitting on Rupi Kaur, or say it's a gateway to real poetry. I jump on it straight away. Going, what an entitled position to take. Who are you to decide what is good poetry and what, you know, like a gateway drug to real poetry. It's an ugly discourse for me. Yeah. You can decide whether a poem resonates with you and then move on. Yeah.
Thank you. I've just got one question over here from this lady.
This is a question coming from curiosity. I'm a bit of a closet poet, like a lot of people that sent poems in about the jacaranda trees.
Yeah. Peter judged that, I think, the jacaranda.
I find when I'm on the train or I'm driving, that's when the lyrics come. And I'm just wondering what sparks you off. Actually, the first line.
Thank you. That's a great question and a great way to finish. Over to you.
Anything. Often, walking is always good, that old-fashioned Wordsworthian thing. You go for a walk and just something comes into your head from somewhere. And then you've got to sit down and work it out later on, the rest of it.
Yeah, similar. I think being on the move. You know, I write on envelopes when I'm waiting for my kids to finish music classes or, you know, whatever. I think we're so busy. Writing has to be part of life, and the thinking of the writing is also part of life.
I think my main three of late would be driving, on the toilet, and Facebook community boards. They are rich for found texts and ideas for me. Yeah.
Can I ask too, as a poet, not the moderator, I definitely find it's when I'm communicating with my friends. So yesterday I quickly online shopped and bought an Indian's, I think they're called snake chains. And then I wrote to her, my friend, and said, oh, I just bought a snake chain. I know that was your thing, and I definitely don't have your clavicles. And I'm like, that's got to go in a poem. You know, it's just recycling my everyday kind of text.
We will remember that work for a long time. Thank you. Oh, sorry, is it a quick question?
No, it's okay.
It's a quick question?
Yeah, no, it's not a question, actually. My mum, who's now 96 and has dementia, 10 years ago, she got up in the middle of the night to get a glass of water, and on the kitchen bench was a cockroach. And she wrote the most amazing poem about the cockroach and how she was going to win. And she's written many interesting poems, but just brought to my mind is where do we write our poetry? So even in the middle of the night, situation will occur and you can write your poem.
And it's lodged in our brain, maybe like song or something deeper than our kind of cognitive everyday brain.
Let me thank you all. What a great panel. I think we've all totally enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Books will be purchased down in the bookstore. Our wonderful poets will be signing the books, so please go and support them. And thanks again for a great panel. Thank you.